nearly 30 years as a career senior intelligence and military affairs officer with expertise in strategic intelligence and asymmetrical warfare. Ooh, I got that out right. He served combat and combat support tours in Grenada, Panama, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as numerous intelligence missions throughout Central America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East and Africa. Among other assignments, Colonel Waurishuk served as Deputy Director for Intelligence for U.S. Central Command during the peak years of the Afghan and Iraq wars on terrorism. Currently, he is a radio talk show host, a contributor. He has many publications, and I'm not going to go any further because I will mess it up. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Colonel Waurishuk, who is going to inform us on the state of our security in our country. Thank you.
I appreciate the invitation and the warm welcome, and it's the first time I've been to this side of the bay to speak, or I should say the St. Pete end of the bay. Spoke over in Clearwater last year a couple times, a lot around Tampa, up north Florida, East Coast.
You need to tell a colonel what to do.
I know. It sounds like it works great when you're holding it, but
Put it next to your chin.
that's better. I usually talk loud enough where I don't even need the mic, so hopefully that'll fill in here as I'm talking. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. Normally when I do these, I try to engage everybody and make it a discussion so everybody feels part of it rather than me stand up here and talk. Because sometimes it goes hours, and sometimes people say, can you keep going? I mean, I did one group a couple weeks ago, we went to 11 o'clock, and I did another one night, and they wanted to go, I think it went to close to midnight. But they were engaged, and they enjoyed it, so.
I'm gonna go ahead and get the coffee on.
I brought my own, because I know from experience. I retired in 2008 and did some defense consulting and advising, and then I started gravitating into other areas because I started getting asked to do something for other groups. Been doing stuff with Fox News, been doing stuff with all the local TV stations in Tampa Bay, predominantly Bay News 9 and Channel 13, Fox 13. They've got a pretty good program on Sunday nights called Money, Power, and Politics, and I've already done 3 of their shows, and it's pretty interesting if you ever get a chance to see it. And I just got recruited about 2 weeks ago by the Trump campaign, so I heard a lot of people clap for the Trump campaign. And they provided me national security advice. I had to write a paper for them last night while I was sitting there and my phone was ringing off the hook. They want something else, so it fits in. But what I wanted to talk mostly about, and again, there's so many. When you look at the Obama administration, you know, I read an article today, so there's writing, it basically started off, every other day it's a new thing. Did you feel that way? Every single day there's a new crisis, there's a new scandal, there's a new somebody did this, somebody did that. It's almost as if they're not even trying to fix it, they're just trying to continuously do things. And those are the things we haven't even, you know, those are the things we've heard about. There's lots of things we haven't heard about. I've been working with a couple groups with the Benghazi Committee, one of the groups that I've been working with. I've been working with them for, since Benghazi happened. First it was Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia's committee that put together enough information and evidence in order for the House to officially set up a formal committee, which is now under Congressman Trey Gowdy. But it took a year and a half to get Congress to formalize and set up a permanent committee on that. And so we finally did that about a year or so ago, as you all know, and you all have been working with them on that. And the big thing now that we're dealing with is the email, which if it wasn't for the Benghazi committee, we may never have found out about the email things that Hillary Clinton is doing. And this is probably, out of all the scandals that we've seen, at least in our lifetimes, from Watergate to Iran-Contra to Bill Clinton's shenanigans in the White House, this is probably the worst, and the information involved is probably the most devastating and damaging. Hopefully it won't come out what it actually is, because it would be horrific to our national security from the standpoint of relations with countries, relations with foreign heads of state and diplomats, and that's where we get into, you've heard the word SAPs, special access programs, and some of you in here in military know exactly what I'm talking about. Those are, I've been involved in a number of those over the years in my career. You sign a line at the end when you're read on to one of these programs, and when you're read off, that if you ever divulge anything about it, it's a $100,000 fine and 10 years in prison. For each one, for every infraction, for every violation. So based on what we've seen on Hillary, she's got, if they ever prosecute her, she's got a long time in prison, and a lot of money. And I know they're doing everything they can to try to prevent that from happening and cover it up. But I think eventually what we're gonna see is a number of situations can happen. Of course, to get an indictment, it's going to take the FBI director to recommend to the Attorney General whatever number of indictments he has prepared based on their evidence and their investigation. And of course, there's a lot of involvement. The president is going to weigh in heavily on that to his Attorney General. After all, she works for him, and it's really on him. A lot of people fail to recognize, and it's almost as if they're putting all the blame on Hillary on it, even though not directly by the Democrats. But the person who has been totally set aside on everything, whether it's Benghazi or whether it's been the Iran deal, whether it's been Hillary's emails in the State Department, is really Obama. You're right. He owns every single thing that goes on in his administration. Just like the CEO of any company, when something goes wrong, you all know it's the CEO whose head is on the chopping block, and they are going to investigate and find out what he or she knew, and they will go after him or her, and they will do whatever necessary to have him or her removed. Obama's been insulated, and that's been by design to protect him from that. But he really owns everything she's done. It's his foreign policy, not hers. All she does is implement it, and all any other Secretary of State does is implement it and execute what's required to be done that the president wants. Same thing for national defense, same thing for our economics, same thing for our international trade. It really belongs to the president, and so we need to look at that, and that's the things that, when we talk to our congressmen and women, if you have that opportunity or you write emails to them, is to remind them that it's the president who has the ultimate responsibility. So kind of take that perspective when you listen to all these scandals that we're dealing with. The other big issue that I am deeply concerned about, and I know many of you are, is this refugee situation. And this is horrific. The UN is at fault. Certainly, our president has failed to understand his responsibility, that his first and foremost responsibility as President of the United States is the safety and security of everyone in this room and every American. there is a thing called compassion and humanity, but this is not it. He is putting forth his preference for what he wants to be seen as a passionate and humanitarian kind of individual, but he is doing it at the detriment to America, to our citizens, and to our future. And that's the key thing. I was talking to some of the gentlemen before the meeting started. One of the things that I've been pushing for that no one else has talked about, in fact, I'm in the process of writing an article and hopefully it will start to work, is very simple. And we all remember San Bernardino a month or so ago, 14 Americans killed and 21 wounded in that event. The question is, what is the risk? It's not about whether we vet people from Syria or the Middle East, because they're all not Syrians. That's the other thing we need to realize. They're all not Syrians. They're from North Africa, they're from the Middle East, they're from Central Asia, they're coming in from everywhere. The word has spread, the word has got out that if you go to Europe, if you go to Canada, if you can make it to the US, they'll take care of you. Now, in Florida, in this part of Florida, up in Pasco County and northern Hillsborough County, that's been designated one of the areas where refugees can go. And I talked to my congressmen and my state representatives and state senators and my county commissioners in Hillsborough and the mayor and a couple others, and I said, you know what? You need to go on record and state what level of risk are you willing to accept. And they tried to tap dance around it. I said, no, you have to give us the level and the degree of risk. What are you willing to accept? Are you willing to accept what we saw in San Bernardino, 14 killed, 21 injured? Is that what you're willing to accept? You got to give a number. There's only one acceptable number, and it's 0. And the only way you get to 0 is by not allowing any of them to come into this country, because all it takes is one. And we'll have a situation like we saw in Texas, or a situation like San Bernardino. You know, we're already dealing with the homegrown radical Islamists who believe that this is their calling and this is what they have to do. And you know, we've seen enough of these type of attacks already, from New York to California and wherever else they've been. But I'm asking everyone to make sure they question their political leaders. What level of risk are you willing to take? We cannot vet these people. FBI Director James Comey told everybody in public in a speech about 2 months ago, told Congress as well in a hearing, that it is impossible for us to vet these people because, one, we cannot get any information out of the Syrian government. 2, there's probably no documentation available or still around now that ISIS has gone into major cities in Syria and Aleppo and others. And so the public records of people aren't there. 3rd, how are you going to, you know, when you do vetting, and the U.S. military and the intelligence community does vetting, and this is what I use as my baseline for the level of vetting. When we recruit foreign agents to work for us, spies, we go through a very thorough vetting process to determine whether they're going to be able to work with us, whether they are willing, whether they are loyal, or going to be loyal to us. It's a hardcore process. Are they going to turn on us 2 months down the road, 2 years down the road? It's really hard to do, and that's dealing with nationalistic and nationalism and degrees of patriotism from the countries they're from. Here we're dealing with fundamental Islam, which is so ingrained and so indoctrinated in them that that's the way they have been brought up their whole lives, and it's hard to get away from that. So we don't know what we don't know, and we have no way of getting any information on them. So, you know, the right thing to do is don't bring them here. It's not going to cost us anything. The world is not going to be upset with America to bring them here. And then there's the other aspect of it. Has anyone ever heard of the UNHCR? The UNHCR is the UN's High Commission on Refugees, who are responsible for assisting and setting up in areas where there are natural disasters, political strife and upheaval, and regional conflicts, to provide safety and security for people, to get them out of the danger zone to a location no further than the next country closest or the next safest area where they determine where people will be safe. The second responsibility of the UN, and we saw this particularly in the 90s with Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo, the UN peacekeeping forces and the UN organizations that go in and try to maintain stability, do stability operations, do peace enforcement in order to stop a conflict, and then go in to help reestablish security zones in the countries where the conflict or the natural disaster has been, and then eventually get the people back in. It's not about moving people out and bringing them into other countries permanently. It's a temporary process. The UN lost control when they started, and the word got out, and the countries in Europe very foolishly offered the opportunity for them to travel all the way from Syria to as far north as Norway and as far west as France and England. And now they're feeling the pain and they're feeling the brunt, and it's costing them both economically and culturally and crime-wise with everything from robberies and assaults and rapes and murders. And that's going on, and that's not taking it lightly. That's a serious problem. Canada has just announced that they're going to bring in 6,000 refugees to their country. They're going to bring them and house them on Canadian military installations, and they're moving Canadian military people out of the installations. They are terminating their international activities in Afghanistan, where they're supporting the ISAF coalition. They're terminating their operations with the coalition in the Middle East, where they're working with various countries on Syria and Iraq. And they're bringing all those forces home because they're going to need them to babysit the refugees and provide services for the refugees. So they're going to be using combat trained forces to do things that they are not responsible for doing. I mean, it's just absolutely, and that's what they got. They elected a new prime minister who is a far left liberal. Trudeau, exactly. And that's the consequences of what they're dealing with. And they haven't even brought in all the refugees yet, so we haven't even seen anything. So I'm sure in the coming months and year, we'll be seeing the same things occurring in Canada as we're seeing happening in Europe. And the other thing in Europe that is even more frightening, if you will, is the fact that for the most part, they've lost accountability and control of most of the refugees that have come in. So they can be going anywhere and doing anything, and we're going to continue to see problems there. So they have no way of maintaining control, knowing their whereabouts. And so I make the point that is this again something that we're going to want to have to deal with. I'm certain this will end in November or certainly January when we get a new president, as long as it's a Republican. But this cannot be an issue that we have to deal with. We've got to clean up the situations that are already totally a mess, and then move on and get ourselves back on track. And that is a tall order that any president is going to have to deal with. What else? Is there anything anybody wants to?
Iranian deal.
That is absolutely the deal that is. I mean, you've read all the news accounts of it and everything. I don't have to say a lot about it other than it's horrendous. The worst thing is the things that were left out and not even brought to the negotiating table. The point about where the nuclear material is going to go. Supposedly it's going to Russia, but the UN has kind of lost track of keeping an eye on where it's going and checking the records and looking at the facilities where it's going in Russia. Some of it's already been put on rail to move north and then to be taken to a port on the Caspian Sea. Other material is going to be trucked, which is probably the worst because it's subject to being hijacked in some of the remote areas of northern Iran, going through Turkmenistan or going through the western portion of Iran into Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then up into Russia. So the ability to monitor and maintain security on that is questionable, and the administration is doing very little to ensure that any of that is going to be taken care of. The other point is the nuclear or the missile systems that the Iranians, ICBMs and medium-range ballistic missiles that the Iranians want to develop. My contention from everything I've dealt with and read, do the Iranians want a nuclear weapon? They want a nuclear weapon. Are they necessarily going to field it on a missile? Two things we see. One will be to hold Israel nuclear hostage. Secondly is to hold Europe nuclear hostage. And third is to use it for a nuclear burst to create an EMP event either over Europe or the US. One of the scenarios that was looked at was they do a small nuke attack on Israel, they take out Tel Aviv, and then they hold Europe and the US nuclear hostage from retaliating against Iran, which might mean a nuclear strike. The other is the Israelis. The Israelis know very well. They have a tripwire. They have their so-called line in the sand. They know how far Iran needs to go to get a nuclear weapon, and they're never going to allow that. I'll get you in a second, both of you. And they can't do anything so overt that it's obvious that Israel's doing it, but they're able to do things to kind of use the cliche, one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back. They can knock them off kilter, they'll do things, they'll do sabotage operations, but they will make sure that Iran doesn't get to the point, the tripwire that they know that there's no return that Iran has a weapon. Iran knows the minute they get a weapon, they actually have to use it, because they will not be able to sit there like North Korea or India or Pakistan and tout the fact that they have a nuclear weapon and thump their chest and let the world know. It will be taken out before that, because Israel can't afford a strike, a single strike. Israel is dealing from the standpoint of survival, where the rest of us, we deal from the standpoint of security. And so Israel knows that they have to do whatever it takes to stop a nuclear strike against them. So from that standpoint, it's not even putting it on a missile or on an airplane to deploy it and use it. There are other methods, and there's a lot of folks who are watching. Is there going to be a smaller capability where they can use Hezbollah to deploy it inside of Israel and do a small nuclear detonation? And then the final thing is using a multiple phase approach for dirty bombs where you get the psychological effect of a nuclear detonation. You don't get the devastation, but you get panic, you get this, and you get the psychological impact. You do get injuries and people harmed, but not at the degree of a nuclear device. And in hope that if they did that, Israel might launch a nuclear strike when in fact it wasn't necessary or called for. So there's a lot of scenarios out there. But the point is, the nuclear agreement did not take into consideration any of those aspects, and therefore it gives Iran the opportunity to continue to work on a weapon. It may slow them down a bit, but this agreement should never have been reached. And in fact, this agreement had started under the George W. Bush administration back in 2002 or so, with no intent of ever, the negotiations were there to get Iran to stop, but there was never an intent to create an agreement, at least by a Republican administration. There's always been an effort to prevent them from getting the materials and the capability to do so. It was the Obama administration that decided that they wanted to get an agreement for the sake of being able to say they got an agreement with Iran to delay or stop the development of nuclear weapons. Sir?
Yeah, I looked at the
If you're
deal.
gonna, would you stand up if you're gonna speak,
Oh.
please? I'm sorry, Tom.
All right. I started looking at the deal when it first came out, and the question that came to my mind is calling it a deal. When I looked at the details, it sounded more like it should be a treaty.
Right.
So could you please educate us on the difference between, where's the line between a deal and a treaty, and where should this have been?
There's no written document though, I understand.
Right. Certainly anything along the lines where you're negotiating with another country, particularly from the standpoint of nuclear weapons, you're exactly right, it should have been a treaty. And the difference with a treaty is a treaty has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and right then and there, it changes the whole ball game, it changes the whole level degree of verification, it changes inspections, it changes everything, and it puts restrictions, it puts, the worst part of this, I guess, is the fact that we are releasing $150 billion in money, in frozen assets to Iran, because that would never be part of a treaty. There's really no monetary aspect when you do a treaty. It's about the actual problem at hand that you're trying to solve. And if we did ever tie frozen assets and sanctions, certainly sanctions can be used as a way to stop a country from doing something under a treaty. The sanctions should be the last thing that are released at the end once an agreement, when I say agreement, I mean a treaty, is fully, plays itself out and proven to have been validated, and therefore this country has no nuclear weapons, or this country hasn't done this. Then the whole second set of negotiations starts as to whether you want to remove sanctions and conduct normal business with that country. So from the standpoint of treaty versus deal, it should have been a treaty, and we should have tied it to when we did this crazy thing with P5 plus 1, that you wouldn't normally get that kind of grouping under a treaty. Everybody would be there on equal footing, and everybody would play by the same sheet of music, because the other thing that came out of this is the other countries, the European countries, also have their own sanctions and have their own assets, Iranian assets that are frozen, and they are also free to move along individually and determine when they will release those. So, I mean, what we're dealing with is there's no set of guidelines of where to go. We might determine, hypothetically, that, okay, we're going to release X number of billions of dollars because you did this, but we're going to increase sanctions because you did another thing wrong, where that is totally unapplicable to the European countries. They can go along under their own individual unilateral negotiations to decide what they're going to release. So, you know, one country might be rewarding Iran for something they see as okay, and we're at the same time doing the opposite. So, I mean, there's no rigidness in this deal that everyone is in agreement on. It's a deal of 6 countries, but each of them can operate separately and how they see fit on it. That's not been talked about, but that's the way it is. And at the end, Iran is going to get upwards of perhaps $1 trillion out of this. You know, so I have to remember, once everything is lifted and business goes on, I mean, there's billions and billions of dollars year after year after year for eternity, if you will, that will continue to go into Iran for them to use for whatever. And it's pretty obviously to most of us that their whole intent is going to be to continue their effort with terrorism, to continue their goal of hegemony in the Middle East. I was at a working group in Washington a couple months ago, and what we could come up with, and we talked to some folks from the various intel communities, that there's with Iran being Shia and Muslim Brotherhood being Sunni, that perhaps Iran would take everything up to the Red Sea, and Muslim Brotherhood would take everything from west of the Red Sea in northern Africa, and put their eyes on Europe and create that caliphate where the Shia would pretty much settle in the Arab Peninsula and the countries of Iraq and Syria, Israel, Jordan, and the divide would be the Red Sea. That's kind of out there, but that was based on some discussions that they had gotten from the Iranians, and similar that they had gotten from the Muslim Brotherhood. So that remains to be seen. I know you had your hand up, and someone over here had theirs.
And David Pryor, St. Petersburg. I keep reading more and more that NATO and U.S. forces are marshaling to go into Libya. I was wondering if you knew anything about that, and is that immediate, or is that maybe a few months down the road?
There was some discussion last week, and it was in the defense budget that's being torn apart and ripped up as we speak, where the administration wanted $200 million, not a lot of money, but to start doing operations inside Libya. And that got a lot of scrutiny from Congress, asking, what are you doing here? What's this? Secretary Carter had to answer that. I believe that was behind closed doors. I don't know what came out of that. But there was a lot of angst. And again, not because it was a lot of money, but because that was on the books as a plan. And they asked, what are you going to do in Libya? They were talking about training Libyan forces, and so kind of doing the same thing, and to prevent Al-Qaeda or ISIS from continuing operations in Libya. We don't even have an organized government yet that has any capability to do that. So there was some angst on that. I haven't seen anything that indicates NATO is going to go in there, nor do I believe NATO would. I served in NATO from 2002 to 2004. I took NATO. I was one of the senior intelligence officers to go with NATO to Afghanistan, so kind of know how NATO works. NATO doesn't do anything, what anybody else says, but NATO doesn't do anything without the U.S. weighing in pretty heavily. Of course, weighing in pretty heavily with the administration we have now kind of just doesn't mean anything. But the European countries are hurting economically. They're trying to do everything they can to save their budgets, and they're not interested in anything whatsoever as far as getting into that again. I mean, when the Obama administration did the operations there a few years ago, they really had to drag NATO into that to get them to play in that game. I don't see NATO wanting to do anything of the sorts in the years to come, at least until things get turned around. They've got a mess to deal with now with all the Syrian refugees in their country. I mean, when you look at the number, that's the other thing. When you look at a country like Syria that had a population of about 24 million people, I think they're down to less than half have left the country. When you lose half your population, and it's because most of them have left because of the situation there as refugees, that's, it's just devastating because you just lost so much capability. Not even looking at it from a standpoint of being a dictatorship under Bashar al-Assad, just day-to-day business and things going on in country, feeding themselves and, doing things that a country does. And now they just have a multi-level, multi-tiered civil war going on, and that's what it really is.
Brent Narog from the great city of Pinellas Park. And by the way, St. Pete, our mayor and our city council are all Republicans except for one, but he votes with us. I have a question about North Korea.
Okay.
We know that they have the nuclear capacity. We know now they're getting into some missile innovations where they could, God knows how far they could go. How do you feel about North Korea? How do we handle them? How do we deal with them?
Well, we dealt with them pretty well until 2009. We kept them in a box, we kept them contained. We put a lot of pressure on China, because China has better leverage over them than we do. And so now, less pressure, no dealings with China on keeping them controlled. The young dear leader there now is flexing his muscles, trying to, I think he's just jealous that nobody paid attention to Korea, so he's trying to do something to get Korea on the map. And, they're trying to launch some satellites, which they did last week. It's leap ahead technology when you can put a satellite in orbit, because it's some of the things that you need. When a country starts launching satellites and they're an adversarial country, there's multiple things you want to watch. One, what kind of satellite, what are they going to do with it? We're not so much interested in whether it's a weather satellite or a communications satellite. We're worried about, it's a spy satellite or it's going to be an anti-satellite against ours. I don't think they have anywhere near the technology to get into that high level kind of thing, but they have a capability to put one in orbit. That's the critical thing. I don't see it as a threat to us I think, and you're never going to hear about it because it's so highly classified, but I'll tell you, if we determined, and I don't care whether it's the Obama administration or Republican administration, that satellite might just disappear. And they'll never know if something went wrong and tumbled and burned up in the atmosphere. It's kind of all I can say on that, other than, we have folks who know what's going on, and they're, the Space Command guys and everything, regardless of the administration, they're still doing their job, and they have national security priorities and what to do and what to look out for, and the commander of U.S. Space Command fared better than I did career-wise. He's a 4-star general now. But he and I went to War College together back in 98, 99 timeframe. So he's a pretty smart guy. I think he's got things. I wouldn't worry about it. I'm more concerned of North Korea on the ground and doing something in South Korea. Granted, they wouldn't get very far. I don't think we'll ever see a Korean War again. Again, China controls, the devastation that happened in the Korean War was a result of the Chinese, not the result of the North Koreans. But I would worry about some small-scale conflict, on the North Korean-South Korean border.
Sultan Camp in St. Petersburg. Two things. When you were talking about Iran getting a nuclear weapon and nuking Israel as a possibility for a strategic route, wouldn't that affect the Palestinians, and doesn't that create a shield?
Sure.
That they don't want to give up on the Palestinians, I don't think, so I'm not sure.
I don't think the Iranians really care about the Palestinians. They're a tool for them to use against Israel. They created Hezbollah as a counter to the Camp David Accord when Egypt and Israel and Jordan and the U.S. actually were the signatories of that accord.
If that would have ramifications if they just bartered David away.
Well, they don't really care about human rights. They don't care about killing their own. And to be blunt, I mean, just look at the Middle East.
My second comment
Yeah.
has to do with the fact that it seems to me the difference between an agreement and a treaty is that the Senate approves it and commits the country to it,
Right.
as opposed to it being an agreement between individuals,
Right.
one government versus
Exactly.
another. So that just the fact that it's a treaty doesn't change the content of what we agreed on.
Right.
It just makes it in writing. And
You're exactly right. You're exactly
We
right.
could attribute a lot of things that would be different. It all depends on what the Senate decides to do.
I mean, a lot of this. I mean, again, this is we're dealing in a very unorthodox time frame here and process. We've never dealt with a president who has abused his constitutional authorities, and we've never dealt with a Congress that didn't. I mean, we haven't dealt with this before. We haven't had a president before who says, I don't really care about negotiating with Congress. I'm just going to, to use the cliche, use my phone and my pen and make laws and make directives and make rules the way I want without Congress coming after you and waiving the Constitution, saying this is unconstitutional. And, there's some things Congress has to leverage that, but, I go back to Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who they'd sit down at the end of the day in the Oval Office or over on Capitol Hill and have a beer together and talk, even though, I wouldn't say they hated each other, but, the Democrats had their agenda then and the Republicans. We never have seen this divisiveness on a part of a president and a Congress reluctant to really do anything. And I think it's, both are trying to get along to stop the hemorrhaging. Maybe that's a bad way to look at it, but we elected between 2010 and 2014 members of Congress to both houses of Congress who said and ran that they were going to stop this, and they haven't. So I mean, there's fault on both sides, but you know, we're dealing with a guy in the White House who just doesn't care. He's going to do it his way, and if you don't like it, his attitude is, "What are you going to do to me?" And we haven't done anything. The only thing we you know, he's out in November, but you know, I think the guy ought to be. I think that, you know, the man should still be impeached. I mean, he's had so many impeachable offenses, and there's no statute of limitations on impeachment. He could be impeached after he's out of office, but we've got to, you know, what is that going to, in a perfect world, you know, the adventures on criminality, what he did with, if you weigh the Constitution and how the constitutional authority that a president has and what he can do versus what Obama has done, and just the political civility where, you know, both houses of Congress and the executive branch are supposed to work together. I know compromise has been a dirty word because now there can no longer be compromise, because if we compromise, with Republicans because they have this unofficial non-authority from the president who will, and the media. I mean, I put most of the blame more than anything else on the media, because the media has not done its job. As the fourth estate and the organization that came to being to be the watchdog over all branches of government, to make sure that they're doing the right thing under the Constitution. And they have failed miserably in the last, certainly 30 years. And it's, you know, it's gotten worse. And so, I mean, someone's going to have to take someone to task and hold people's feet to the fire, whether it be the Democrats or the Republican Congress. I try to stay out of the political realm, but of course it's the nature of the beast, and it's what's driving everything the way it is. A lot of times when I speak, I hold up the list of all the violations and abuses and everything that this administration has done. You know, normally, you know, there's going to be scandals, and you know, maybe one per administration, and when you look back in hindsight compared to what's going on in this administration, I mean, every single thing happening, whether it's foreign policy or trade, all the various domestic issues, there's a hidden agenda behind everything, and the administration is not being upfront with Congress when they present what they're doing, and they hide things. I mean, I worked, failed to mention, I worked in the Bush 41 administration. I was intel aide to the National Security Advisor on the NSC staff. Worked in the Situation Room. And having been there and been worked on the Joint Staff and spent a lot of time in the Pentagon, I worked for 6 or 7 months in the Clinton administration, and it was the worst 6 or 7 months of my life. And that was just when the Clinton administration, when we transitioned from Bush 41, who was, as far as military, you know, there's no greater love for the military than George H.W. Bush, certainly being a military person himself. And his son, George W., all know everything he does for the military. Whether you liked him or not as a president, I think he would, I think he tried to do everything with a distinction of honor. Just because you try to do your best at what you do and you make mistakes doesn't make you a bad person. Where everything right now with this administration is so intentional and deliberate. But the joke I always told people after I was in the Pentagon when we went from Clinton to George W. Bush. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, so I went through that experience. But I told people, I said, go look at the GSA, the Government Services Administration, and see how many shredders the White House is buying 6 months before the change of administrations to the, because that'll tell you something. Of course, everything is electronic now, so they don't need shredders, but yeah, they still do. I'd be curious to what starts happening about August, and if it's the writing is on the wall for sure. And I can remember when the campaign was going in the summer of '92, being inside the White House, we knew by September that George H.W. Bush wasn't going to get reelected, even though the election wasn't until November. The people who follow us closely, of course they don't advertise it, it's the last thing you want to do, but they pretty much knew. So the writing will be on the wall, I think, by this summer, regardless of who the candidate is, whether the Democrats are going to win again, or certainly the Republicans hopefully will win again. But, I would watch, if it looks like the Democrats are out, well, I'd be watching how many shredders are on the list to get rid of.